Hi folks, this is Chris DiBiase, aka Iron Lungs, with my first Premodern video, and today I'm going to be taking us through my most recent Premodern burn build that I used to take down one of the recent Magic Online Society bi-weekly playoffs. I've been playing this list now for a couple of weeks, and I think the reason you're probably tuning in is because it has one pretty significant departure from what I typically do with my lists that I've been testing, and so I want to talk a little bit about the rationale behind that change in the list and how it's been performing. And then what I'm going to try to do is walk us through my playoff matches and talk us through kind of my thinking about those matches, and we'll see where we turn up. So thanks for tuning in, and let's kind of look at the deck. So if you look at the deck, this is a fairly stock Premodern burn list. If you've looked at my other lists, which I will link to below, you'll notice that this is pretty close to what I typically run. I'm usually running something very close to Aaron Dix's Bauble burn list. Occasionally I switch things up with one or two Goblin Patrols. I was off it for this particular build, but the big change in how I configured this deck was to go up from 19 lands to 20, which is something that Rich Shea has been fiddling around with. He's running 3 Barbarian Ring and 9 Mountain. I'm going with 2 Barbarian Ring and 10 Mountain. That may not necessarily be correct, but for the purposes of this particular run, I just wanted to have that extra Mountain in the build. And the reason why I went up to 20 lands was because I was experimenting with Phyrexian Furnace in the place that Bauble usually occupies. So essentially this is, 4 Bauble out, 3 Furnace and 1 Mountain in. So what's the logic behind using Phyrexian Furnace? So first I want to start with a caveat. I am not making any large conclusions about whether this is the right build. This is purely an experiment. I think it's important to fiddle around with established builds to see what's going on. So why Furnace? One of the ways that I think about playing Burn is to think about, in the matchups that I lose, what are sort of the pivot points in those matches. So for example, if we think about the Burn versus Elves matchup, I am fundamentally convinced that the most important card in that matchup from the Elf side is Anger. If I go through all of my playthroughs with the deck against Elves, losses to that deck, barring losses tied to variance, are overwhelmingly a result of anger-related shenanigans with survival in play, right? So anger being problem number 1, and the survival engine being problem number 2, because typically what you're trying to do is to kind of shut down their game plan as much as possible for the early turns and then turn the corner. How they fight back is by building up a mass of resources and then pulling off, shenanigans. And if you can cut Anger or Squee from that equation, it makes it much harder for them to do that, and the matchup becomes far less scary. And then I started thinking about other matchups, right? So for example, I would suggest that Burn has a pretty iffy matchup against something like Angry Hermit in game 1, because you can't meaningfully interact with the Dreadnought plan, and you can't really meaningfully interact with the Ghoul plan other than hoping that they bring themselves down so low off of Reanimate that you can finish things off with a flurry of Burn in response. There are other matchups too where the graveyard plays a role. Madness is certainly one of them. In fact, I was sort of inspired to try Furnace after watching a playoff match between Paul Master and Cyberpunker, where some early Phyrexian Furnaces on Paul Master's side really helped to kind of take the wind out of Cyberpunker's sails in terms of their Squee engine. So I started thinking about, well, what does Bauble do, right? Well, Bauble does a couple of things in the deck. It feeds Grim Lavamancer, right, very efficiently. It cycles for 1, so you get through your deck quicker. You have some increased velocity. And it does give you some information about your opponent's hand. And in conversations about Bauble versus non-Bauble lists, this is a point that I've brought up multiple times, right? That one of the benefits is that free information that you get. I mean, it's not really free, you're paying a cost for running Bauble, but that's kind of a secondary conversation, right? So if its primary functions are feeding Lavamancer and pushing you through the deck, are there other things that can do that? And one of the things I've sort of noticed after playing, I've been playing Burn almost exclusively since February of 2023. I've certainly had, I think, some success with the deck. One of my observations is that you have a number of games, especially when you're in what Michael J. Flores would call Gear 2, right, where you're in suppression mode, where you don't need to burn every mana available. You frequently have some mana to spare as you're sort of sitting and waiting for things to happen. You're weighing out your decisions. So that kind of got me thinking about, could Furnace operate in the same space or a similar space that Bauble operates in? It cycles. It's inefficient, right? That is important to note here. There is a cost to it. It's 1 to cast, 1 to cycle. And so it's not nearly as effective as Bauble on turns 1 or 2 when you're trying to kind of push through the deck or feed Lavamancer early. But if the game starts going longer, right, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, then you frequently find yourself with the necessary mana to drop it on one turn and then expend a mana on some subsequent turn where you've got nothing else going on. You're just looking to draw. But in a number of matchups, you don't even really necessarily want to cycle it because you can be using its ability to impact the graveyard effectively, right? So whether that is, again, using it versus elves, keeping Terravors at bay, right? If we think about the Terravor matchup, a Terravor at 5 toughness is a challenge to deal with. That's probably the number one way they get you, is that you cannot efficiently remove it. This is particularly true in the mono green versions of Terravor, right, that TV Tyrant has been running, where they have the opportunity to build the land in the graveyard count without necessarily relying on Oath to do it, because they're running things like Winter's Grasp. So all this got me thinking about, are there enough matchups where having a way to interact with the graveyard would get you some percentage points without necessarily jeopardizing your other matchups, right? So that's kind of where this comes from. Are there spots where Furnace is not useful? Yes. It's trash versus goblins. It is not good against Stiflenaught. But those are matchups where Bauble isn't necessarily going to save you. And it also gives you a little bit of flexibility in your boarding to bring in stuff that might be a little bit more effective in those matchups. So there are trade-offs here, right? And that's why I'm not drawing any firm conclusions yet, but I am kind of experimenting with it to see whether or not it can perform the Bauble role while adding some play against matchups that, even if they're not necessarily bad matchups, like there's no one who would say I think Elves is a bad matchup, but it's certainly a more challenging matchup than I think most people assume. And if we can cut off the axis by which they typically find a way to win, then I think that is important. Just a quick overview of the rest of the list, right? This is really stock, for Lavamancer, for Pup. I have a Flex Dart here. It doesn't have to be Dart, but for the time being, I very much like what Dart can do in the deck. Bolt, Fanatic, Shock, 2 Curse Scroll, 4 Incinerate, 2 Vortex, 4 Ball Lightning, 4 Fire Blast. In terms of the sideboard, 3 more Dart. I'm a big proponent of having access to at least 3 Dart, if not 4 Dart, between your main deck and your sideboard. This is my little anti-artifact package. Mog Salvage is some tech from Cyberpunker who suggested it's great in some contexts, it's less great in others. It depends on what you're expecting. It's a nice way to get around the mana efficiency of something like 12-12 decks. It's also pretty cool against stasis decks, especially if they're not don't expect everyone to see it coming. We have a suite of blasts here in my most recent league, which I 4-1'd. I switched the ratio here 4 to 3. But this is also important as part of your anti-Stiflenaught package if you expect to see it, and it also has relevance in a number of other matchups. 4 Price of Progress, which are just so critical against fast combo. Punishing the Rock, punishing Landstill, and then 1 Flaring Pain as a hedge against Cop Red. So I'm going to wrap up the deck tech here, and then in the next part of this video, we'll start walking through the first match of the most recent, or I guess second most recent at this point, MOS playoff. So stick around. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through some recordings of my playoff matches, and I apologize in advance because I didn't record these live, so I'm kind of finagling something using the way that MTGO records each match. So hopefully this will work, but I apologize if there's any kind of flubs as we go through this. So let's see how this works. So I've won the die roll. I've got my opening 7. And you can see this opening 7 is just not keepable. There's too much risk of getting stuck on one land, particularly with 2 Incinerate and the Fire Blast. I can't afford that, so I'm going to ship it back. This hand is much better. As you can see, I've got the option of throwing back a Fire Blast, and that still leaves me with 2 mounts for the second one, as well as a couple of opening plays. So I fetch and open on Pup, which is promptly going to get foiled. Now it's worth noting before we go any further that when I prepare for these playoffs, these are closed deck list playoffs, but because the way that the Magic Online Society system works, our leagues feed into the playoffs, and so I typically like to do before my matches is to go back and see what my opponents have played in previous leagues. This particular opponent has been on Grotog, so I kind of expected that coming in. I did not expect a foil on essentially turn 0, but, you know, we'll deal with it. So here our plan is going to be to drop Fanatic. I'm playing around days here, so I'm not putting Lavamancer in early because if they are on Grotog, Lavamancer is going to play a big role, and this will lead to a big misplay on my part later. Now this is really unfortunate because Psychotog is probably their best card game 1 against us. It's really hard to deal with. I'm playing Furnace and walking into Daze, which is unfortunate. I should have held back. The reason why, if it's not obvious, Tog is such a terrible card for us in this matchup is it's just very difficult to control. Almost all of their other creatures that they play, all of their other threats are things that we can generally manage, barring some Dryad shenanigans with Daze, etc., and we are tapped out. But Tog is another matter entirely. Now, Furnace is going to help us keep it low, and I suspect that if I were to go over this match really carefully, with a fine-tooth comb, I could probably find ways that I could manage Tog better, but as you're going to see, it's just a difficult card to deal with game 1. My plan here is essentially to let it keep on swinging until I think it can hit lethal, or close to lethal. End of turn, you'll see me removing the bottom of the graveyard just to reduce the number of ways they can grow. Here, I'm just trying to force them to discard or clear their yard as much as possible. That is arguably incorrect. In fact, it's likely an incorrect play on my part. But I haven't played this matchup a ton, and so knowing that Tog is kind of threat number 1, I'm just fiddling around with ways to keep its size manageable and buy myself some time. These are not ideal draws. Again, we're going to keep that yard as empty as possible so they can only work off of what's in hand. Here we sort of Mize a Shock, and that's going to let us deal with Dryad before things get worse. Right, and the issue here is simply they have too many cards in hand for me to effectively deal with this Tog. Here I'm just sort of getting desperate. I know the writing is on the wall. against basically everything but Tog. I would love to see that curse scroll. Orb is not especially important here. But that's sort of where this match ends up. So we're going to go to our next match, and then I'll talk briefly about the sideboarding that I tried and walk us through it. Okay, so we are on to game 2. I will be on the play. Before we get going, I just want to talk a little bit about the sideboarding for this matchup. Because Psychotog is our biggest concern, and because we have to worry about chill coming out of the board, I take out all of the ball lightnings and bring in 4 blasts, and that's basically it. So let's get started. So here, you can see this is not a great opener. I have some plays, but I'm going to be taking a lot of damage from my own Barbarian Ring, and it's not enough. I do not feel like I want to be so greedy as to run with the 1-lander, especially if it's Barbarian Ring, especially if I'm on the play. I want to be able to protect against daze if necessary, so we're going to ship this back. Okay, much more keepable hand. We have some Pyroblasts, we have Bolt, we've got Shock. Here, I end up tossing back the Scroll. That's debatable. There are reasons to kind of keep it, because if you do hit that 3rd land, it's a really great card in this matchup as it goes along. But I want early answers just in case, and I'm happy to grab that later if the opportunity arises. So we're leading on Mountain instead of fetching. We want to just increase our chance of hitting that 3rd land if we can. Vortex, if it lands, is really nice in this matchup. There's not much they can do about it. And so it really does put some pressure on. So not much we can do about fire. At least just 1 target. Could have been 2 later on. Certainly been blown out by that in the past in other matches. Here we're just laying out, 1 threat at a time, holding up mana. We're not going to use Shock, we're not going to use Lightning Bolt, there's no reason to go face yet. We know that if we can manage their threats, we're going to be fine. I want to call something out here really quickly. That's a smart play. Here, my opponent names Shock, and the idea here, the logic, right, is that if he names Shock, then I am typically going to be forced to spend a 3 damage spell to take out the Meddling Mage, and so it's simply, some added value for him. Now in this case, I do have the Bolt available, so I'm happy to clear it out, although I'm about to walk into Daze. And there's the Daze, so, in retrospect, I probably could have waited a turn. Fortunately, I draw the 2nd Lightning Bolt. Unfortunately, it gets foiled. So we're just going to have to sit a little bit longer. But still incorrect to play into Daze there. There was really no good excuse for doing that. Here, I'm just going to keep swinging. Chip away at damage. I know that eventually I'm going to find a way to manage Meddling Mage. Right, Incinerate's an option. Potentially, it's super inefficient, and it is soft Daze. And it's not going to be relevant because I have to stop that chill. Now, Lavamancer is an answer. And a really strong one in this matchup if he can't deal with it. He's already used up 1 fire. So I'm in a fairly good position. I'm down to 10 life, but that's plenty. It's enough of a cushion. We're going to start being able to turn the corner shortly. I'm still not going to tap out for Pup here because I do not want to run into another chill. So the reason why I am doing that is I want to take care of Dryad before anything else happens, and I do not want to expend a shock to do it because I cannot risk Chill or Tog coming down right now. My opponent only has 2 cards in hand, and so I need to think very carefully about making sure I do not provide them any ways to steal this matchup. There's an argument to be made that I should hold the pup here and play a little slower to avoid getting blown out by fire, or to avoid a situation where they go Chill into Daze, but it paid off. We're swinging here just to keep up as much mana as possible, to try and either sneak in an Incinerate maybe later, or if not, I can still launch a couple of shocks. They're down to 8. It's looking pretty good. They're going to try and Chill. It doesn't really matter that much here. And now I've just got really too much for them to deal with. There are a lot of ways to finish out this game, but my opponent's going to do me the favor of conceding in style on his next turn with the double City of Brass activation. And we'll get to game 3. Okay, we are on to game 3. I'm on the draw. So just really quick about my opening hand here before we go any further. This is a lot of land for an opening hand. There's an argument that it's not enough, but I feel good with the pup. I've got a little bit of early interaction. I know that Chill is a threat, and so hitting lands is not the worst thing in the world. Spoiler alert. So we went with it, and we're going to see how far it gets us. So they're going to open with some cantrips. Here we're going to lead with pup off of the fetch because I feel like we have enough lands in hand. I'm not worried about continuously drawing more, although my deck is going to give me a few. And our goal here is just to do as much possible damage with pup before things get out of hand. Now, if you remember earlier, I talked about getting blown out potentially by fire. I get a little greedy here and get double fire online for my opponent, who promptly and correctly punishes me for that. And that's ultimately going to make this game a bit harder to win. Walking into that was not great. Happy to draw the Pyroblast. It gives me some play against either Tog or Chill, whichever comes down. I am more than happy to take Meddling Mage Beats. I would rather hold on to Dart against Dryad, and now I've got a little bit of backup, additional backup against Chill with 2 blasts in hand. We're going to have a little bit of a fight over this, which I will ultimately end up losing. So I'm now going to get rid of Mage before Chill comes down, just so I can be as efficient as possible. Losing the land is not ideal under Chill, but in the moment it felt right. I have got some Mana Flood plot armor here going on. I will happily pay 3 for a Lavamancer in this case. Our options are pretty limited. It's worth noting that my opponent has done a decent amount of damage to themselves off of City of Brass, and I'm happy for that to be a star player on my team. Again, if you're dealing with chill, it's not the worst thing in the world. This is a really good, or this match I think is a really good example of just be patient, right? So I'm under double chill, I was able to get off the shock. Barbarian Ring is live. I am flooding like mad. I'm holding this just as a bluff. Fire Blast is pretty decent under chill. Even with double chill. 5 mana Grim Lavamancer, sure, why not? The challenge with double chill is you really can't overload their counters. You're just too tight on mana to do that. So Dryad is live. I'm going to wait to do anything with Ring. And now I've got Lethal, right? I'm representing Lethal. I have enough mana to actually do all of this in one turn. And that changes the equation here a little bit. Because in theory, I could go and just remove the Dryad if they try to do anything. But I think now again, hindsight is 2020. I think my decisions paid off. They might not be objectively right, but my mindset here is, you have a certain number of opportunities for the win, and you have to take them when you get them. Right? They play the diamond. I think that's a mistake, just because I think if I'm my opponent here, I want to represent as many cards as in hand as possible to give me pause. I'm not entirely sure what the diamond buys them in this instance, other than giving me information that I'm happy to have. So here I have a choice, right? I can either attempt to ring the Dryad before it gets out of range, or I can just say, let's see what happens, and that's where we're going. So we're going to quickly find out what they have in hand. We don't care about the first days, and we don't really care about the second one that's coming. And so we're just going to go for it, right? We don't really have a ton of other options, and it pays off for us in the end, and that's the match. So even with the double chill and the flood, things played out pretty well there. Okay, so we're back with round 2 of the playoffs. Get started. It's our recap. So I am on the draw here, but I have a very aggressive opening 7 with triple pup, Fire Blast, and Lavamancer, and enough lands to get things going, so we end up keeping. They lead on Treetop. This suggests to me that they are playing their Gamekeeper Phantom Neshoba rock-ish combo deck. I actually played the same matchup in the previous playoffs. It's a tricky deck to play against because you have to be very careful with not triggering Gamekeeper, and obviously a fast Neshoba is not ideal. This particular build does have one advantage from my last playoff build in that it has Phyrexian Furnace, which can negate Gamekeeper's trigger. So we're just kind of cracking in with a bunch of pups and finishing this off with an Incinerate just to keep them tight on mana. And now we've got the Furnace in play. and this is really going to cut off their options, because now they have to deal with the pups, and they have to deal with the furnace before they're going to be able to get their game plan going. They don't have time to hard cast Neshoba. There's just too much pressure on the table, and I think at this point they recognize that they don't have what they're going to need in order to stop the assault. So very, very quick game one, and then we're going to move on to game two. Okay, so we are back for match 2, game 2 of the MOS playoffs. So just before we get started, really quick on my sideboard plan. So in this case, I'm bringing in all of my Price of Progress, and I am cutting a Lava Dart, a Shock, and Curse Scroll. This is not how I would typically sideboard against a more traditional rock build, because you do want the ability to grind with Curse Scroll. However, usually I'd be siding out my pups for my pops, but because they don't really have meaningful blockers other than Gamekeeper, and because pup can get in quite a bit before Gamekeeper comes online, I think it's worth it to keep them in. So our game plan here is either to win as quickly as possible, or at least stop their combo using a Furnace if possible, or Vortex gives you at least some flexibility in terms of not having to worry about the life gain. So let's get the match started. So again, I'm on the draw here. So this hand is not really keepable. It has Phyrexian Furnace, which is important for shutting down Gamekeeper. Again, this is another little ancillary benefit to running Furnace. In the main deck, this is not the most common deck you're going to run into, and yet it does provide that sort of extra percentage points of value when it comes up. Now it's worth noting, right, I think this is still too greedy of a hand if that Furnace is a bauble, but you could possibly consider it. I don't think it's strong enough in this particular matchup, because you need to be able to deploy more than one thing a turn if you're going to try and race. So we're sending this back. So this is at least better in that I have mana to work with here. I can hopefully get in some chip damage with Fnatic. I have a couple of pieces of burn. Price of Progress could pay off depending on how they sequence their lands, so we end up keeping this and shipping back one land. So Duress gets Price of Progress. It's fine, it's early, it wasn't going to, and that's always our risk here, is that it's a card you kind of want to draw later when you can actually use it, because it is susceptible in these matchups to discard. Fnatic is going to do what Fnatic does, which is just try and get in as much as they can. So here they play Engineered Plague, and I have a decision to make about whether or not to sacrifice Fnatic in response in case they name Goblin, or hope that they name something else so I can continue to get chip damage in. So in this case, I end up kind of not calling their bluff, but assuming that maybe they're going to name something to knock out Ball Lightning, rather than just go after Fnatic, but as you'll see, that is not the case, so I do lose that 1 point of damage. At this point, I'm going face, because Shock, Lightning Bolt, etc. have very limited utility at this point. It's going to take too many of them to take down a Neshoba if it gets into play. Again, ordinarily, this is not how I would play against a more traditional rock build, because you might want to hold on to those burn spells to take out a treetop, but Shock can't do that anyway by itself. So here we have to pause for a moment and think about what we're doing. So we can't deploy Ball Lightning because we have to worry about Deed. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about this particular kind of Gamekeeper build is, because they are not tapping out every turn, it allows them to hold up more mana for Deed than you would see in a more traditional rock build that kind of has to use its mana more consistently. So here we're just going to be holding on to Ball Lightning until we see either a window to get in, or we can bait it for something else. So in this case, right, you could make the argument here that if I run out Ball Lightning, they'll pop Deed, and that clears the way for Lavamancer. And that is absolutely a viable line. It's just not the one I chose to explore with this particular match. So now I kind of see where they're going with this. They have the mana to actually hard cast into Shoba. So we are just going to try and unload as much as possible. There's the Nishoba. It's definitely not what we want to see. It's a difficult threat to deal with for lots of reasons. It's hard to make it smaller. We don't have great removal. And so now we're just kind of trying to race in. Honestly, we're hoping to draw Vortex or some way to put away the game, and we get lucky. Plot Armor delivers the Vortex. This is going to buy us time. Holding off on Ball Lightning worked out well here, because now we can get in for the 6 and just start, chopping them down. And now a lot of things have to go right for us, but we've tried to put ourselves in the best position to play to our outs. So they're at 13. We're holding up 5 damage in hand. We have the ability to get 2 more damage off of Barbarian Ring and 2 off of Vortex at the start of the next upkeep. So that's going to bring us up to 9. And Price of Progress here shows up to finish the job. It is worth noting that this matchup is not nearly as easy as it looked in this replay. I got some very, very strong draws against my opponent, and while I think we did everything we had to maximize our chance of victory, we absolutely got lucky by ripping the Vortex and ripping. We had several outs. We had all 4 pops available. We had, the chance of drawing Fire Blasts, but we were lucky to win this as easily as we did in this particular match. I do think, what this particular match shows is, again, trying to be patient with Ball Lightning and kind of looking for your window to get, not just ramming it out there as soon as you can. And again, just trying to understand, when you can afford to play in a more sort of suppression Gear 2 mode, and when the way in which your matchup is aligned simply will not allow you to do that, right? Which frees you up to think more about how you use those burn spells. And in this case, it was pretty clear to me that there was no way of winning this matchup aside from drawing an early Phyrexian Furnace to kind of slow them down. That wouldn't involve doing as much damage as quickly as possible and needing to maximize every point of that damage. So that is a cap on round 2. So we're moving on to round 3. Okay, so we're on to match 3, game 1 against Phil. Phil is typically on his super unique build of the Rock, which is running usually all 4 deranged Hermits. We've met in the playoffs before, and I was, lucky to take down our last meeting. This is a perfectly reasonable opening hand. We've got 1-drops, we've got, some finishers, so here we go. So they open up on Bird. I am going to get rid of that really quickly, because I do not want them accelerating into anything that I cannot handle, or an early Baloth, so we'll follow up with Pup. Because they're tapped out here, I can deploy Ball Lightning very easily and get in there. They correctly block the Pup. But we're trying to be really proactive to kind of force their decision making. So here we have a couple of options. I am going to push through Ball Lightning and see what they do. they don't have a lot of great options here in terms of how they respond to it, right? They can block and sack, they could block and not sack, but either way they're taking some damage, and it's a trade-off for the life gain they're going to get later. But one of the ways we beat this deck is just by forcing them to, you know, make decisions that work for us and ultimately aren't going to work that well for them. No need to block here. They come in. Again, they're 4, deed away Lavamancer. And oh look, it's another Ball Lightning that's going to get in without a problem. And now they're just in a really rough spot. Even if they sacrifice it, 6 damage is not that much for this deck to deal. We already have 2 on board with Barbarian Ring. And here, the right move is just to get rid of Fire Blast before they name it. There's no reason not to. And they can see on the spot. They know that this is done. So again, there's been some chatter about how many Ball Lightnings we should be running in this particular deck. I am still a fan of running the full 4. I know a couple people have gone down to 3. I think with this mana base of 20 lands and a couple of, whether it's Baubles or Furnace, you can support the full 4. And particularly in Game 1, the ability just to apply that kind of pressure and make them have to respect it, I think it still has a lot of value. So again, sometimes Gear 1 chooses you and you get what you need to sort of be super proactive in this matchup. It doesn't always happen, but you know, giving yourself the opportunity to put them on the back foot is a big help. You know, the best way I think to deal with life gain is to win fast, and this is one of the ways that you can do it. Okay, so we are at match 3, game 2 against Phil on the Rock. Our opener is not keepable. We cannot get by on this. Not enough 1-drops. You don't want to be relying on Barbarian Ring. It's just an easy ship. Second hand is much more reasonable. We have a little bit of early interaction if we need it. Price of Progress can pay off dividends later on. And we've been running hot with Ball Lightning, so I think I'm inclined to keep this. I sent back the Fire Blast. There's an argument that I should have sent back Ball Lightning, but, you know, you make your choices. So here they open on an early Wall of Blossoms. This makes Ball Lightning look a little bit worse. We're going to start shocking and try to grind a little bit with Cursed Scroll if we can. We have that 3rd mountain. So here they're playing out Elder. They've got a bit of a board presence. In this case, we're probably not going to get a better opportunity to get Ball Lightning in. At least here they have to make some decisions about what they want to do with it. So it still gets in for 2. It clears future blockers. Now we are in a really bad spot. So one of the things that I think people don't recognize enough in this matchup against Burn is just how critical the discard is. We do not have a lot of great ways to recoup card advantage, and so if this Fet Therapy lands and they can flash it back, we are really working at a disadvantage. So here they name Price of Progress, they flash it back to get Incinerate, as they should. They get some value off of Elder. And they're able to draw a card with Razor. Okay, I make an incredibly boneheaded play here. I want to call myself out for a very big punt. There is no reason why this Phyrexian Razor should not die. However, I went back and looked at the game log, and in my haste to get rid of it, instead of selecting Lava Dart, I selected Phyrexian Rager because I was so tunnel visioned on my target. And this is going to come back and bite me hard in the rest of this game. Now you could ask, like, maybe I shouldn't have done it on upkeep. It doesn't really matter at this point. But here's where this punt is going to get me, right? Because now they're going to be coming in with multiple villages and Rager, who's going to get in for more damage that should have any right to get in for. And ultimately, there are a couple of spots. We can even back this up a little bit just to kind of go to the videotape. If we want to look at some of the decision points here. So there's an argument to be made here after I punt on the curse scroll activation. That I should, instead of bolting the bird, cast and flashback dart on Rager to save myself some damage. Playing out Vortex here might have also been a bad decision because they are putting down more pressure than I can handle. But ultimately, things just do not break my way. The double therapy was critical. The punt on Rager was not ideal. And so there are lots of reasons that match went poorly, at least some of which can be directly attributed to me getting tunnel vision and then kind of, I wouldn't say tilting after that mistake, but certainly not making ideal plays. So that's going to bring us to match 3, game 3 in just a moment, and we'll wrap up this match. Okay, so we are back with match 3, game 3, trying to recover from the punts. So I'm on the draw. Here I keep Lavamancer's Scroll and Ball Lightning. It's not like the best opener, but it's not crazy to keep this hand. Here Duress is going to take Scroll. Again, discard is huge, especially in this case because it's going to strip away some recurring damage, especially since we have the mana to actually support it in this game. So here I'm not swinging. I want to be able to keep the activation live. We're going to get him for 2. Here we have the opportunity to send in a Ball Lightning with Lavamancer. We're going to drop him to 11. And again, ripping that Fire Blast really helps. Just cut down the amount of time they have to do anything of value. And here, Shock, double Fire Blast, and the activations are going to get us there. It's important to note here that while the double Fire Blast was really fortuitous, we were in a spot with them at 11 life where we had a host of outs. So if we back up just a second here. So we have them at 11. We're going to get 2 off the Shock regardless. We're going to get 2 off Lavamancer regardless. Even before we draw this Fire Blast, we're going to have 4 damage there. That's going to bring them down to 3. And we have a ton of outs at that point to just end the match. We still have 4 Bolt that we haven't seen. We have 4 Incinerate that we haven't seen. We have the 3 remaining Fire Blasts, one of which we drew here, that we had yet to see. And then you could factor in things like Shock, gets them down to 1. A pop would have gotten them down to 1. So we were in a pretty good spot regardless. But obviously ripping that second Fire Blast, again, plot armor is key. And again, how you get past Baloth, you beat them on turn 4 on the play. Okay, so we are in the finals of the MOS playoffs against TV Tyrant, known for his mono green Oath Ponza deck. We've actually tested this matchup quite a bit. I have a lot of respect for the time energy he's put into developing this list. This is not an easy matchup for red. It's significantly harder than the green-white Oath builds like Francisco has been playing. In part because one of the ways that we lose this matchup is a Terravore that gets bigger than a 4/4. And certainly once it's at like a 6/6, it's really hard to deal with. And a 7/7 is really an incredible number of resources necessary to reclaim the board. So how do we prevent that from occurring? In the green-white builds, it's more or less about not triggering Oath. If you don't trigger Oath, it really reduces their ability to grow their own Terravore. They have to kind of get by on their fetches. Wasteland's not great because we run so many basics, and if we can kind of judiciously fetch only when necessary, we can kind of make it a little bit easier on ourselves. But the mono green builds run Stone Rain effects, and so they have a much easier time artificially inflating the size of their Terravore even without an Oath activation. So this is partly why I originally thought about Furnace as a way to get an edge in this particular matchup, because it gives you a main deck way to interact with their graveyard that allows you to, at least over time, keep it to a more manageable level. It also allows you to fetch more safely depending on how you sequence, because if you have nothing to remove from their yard, you can start removing stuff from yours. And while that is a bit of a non-bow with Grim Lavamancer, sometimes Lavamancer cannot get into play if there's an Oath on the table, so it kind of can cut in a number of different ways. So let's get on with the match. This hand is not keepable. We have to send it back. We cannot get by on a one-land hand against a land destruction deck. I end up tossing back Incinerate here, which I would not do in most matchups, but because I expect land destruction, I'm happy to play a slower game and make sure that I have the mana to actually cast my spells. Furnace is just going to do work here, picking off the graveyard. I sort of alternate back and forth just to make sure there are as few lands as possible in play. Here they have a man land. That is another way that they can beat us. But we can sort of move into a suppression mode, and I'm happy to trade these two shocks in a moment for that treetop village when they come swinging in. And the goal here is really just to kind of control the board as long as possible and find a way to win later. We're not going to be able to race these man lands at this point. And one of the things that's kind of important to note here, I'll just pause for a second, is that destroying manlands keeps the board clear, but it enables them to then play a larger Terravore, right? So there's this interesting synergy, right? If you deal with the manlands, then you have to deal with the larger Terravore later. With Furnace, we can offset at least a little bit of that by, again, removing these lands ultimately from the graveyard over time. And we have the time to do that because as long as we do not trigger Oath of Druids, he just has to draw naturally into Terravore. Now, whether or not he has one in hand, I don't know. If we look right now at the graveyard, right, even if he were to play one, it would be a 3/3 and we could handle that. Here, we're just going to take care again. We're just keeping the board clear. We'll find a way to win later. We have time. At least right now we have time. And we kind of have this interesting thing where he's fortunate to keep drawing manlands, and we are fortunate to keep drawing ways to get rid of them. So here we're playing Sulfuric Vortex. I want to shout out Lanny for a moment because he has been an advocate for 4 Vortex in the main deck, or at least in the 75 of Burn, under the theory that if you can get a Vortex on the board, then you can afford to spend your burn spells on controlling what's going on, right? You can suppress the board, and I think that theory is incredibly sound, right? Here, we kind of did that in reverse. We used a lot of our resources to keep the board clear. We are now sort of in top deck mode. We assume that our top decks are going to be able to race theirs. For the most part, that's what we're hoping. And so I think that even though I am not on the 4 Vortex plan, because I am not convinced yet that that is viable with either a Bauble or Furnace-based build, I think if you're not running those, then there's an incredibly strong incentive to go with 4 across your 75. And now we're really just playing a waiting game, right? Every turn that they don't do something meaningful is a turn that we can remove something from their yard. At the moment, there are 3 lands in the yard. They could, in theory, get their Terravore if they drew one to a 4/4. But again, we could always, sacrifice Furnace if we needed to. To deal with that, right? And get it down to like a 2/2. And they don't know that we don't have a way to deal with it, right? We've been holding something for a while. And Vortex just continues to take both of us down. So now we're just waiting to draw a land. They don't have a really good way to engage with this in the absence of a man land, so we'll sit tight, wait for us to get the land. We're not going to rush it. Stick with the game plan. This will get them down to 4. And now they're really short on outs because they've got a 2-turn clock with Vortex. Less if I draw anything else. And that will be the match. So, or the game, I should say. So let's move on to game 2. Okay, so we're in finals. Round 4, game 2 against TV Tyrant. In terms of the sideboarding for this matchup, pups come out. So all 4 pups come out. They're just too big of a risk against Oath, and they're just not necessary in this matchup. At least I have found that they haven't been that necessary in the matchup. I shave a Ball Lightning and a Vortex, and the reason for that, particularly when I'm on the draw, is that there have been many games in testing with Tyrant where I just never have the mana necessary to execute them because of a combination of land destruction, port, sphere, etc. So I shave those, and I also shave one Grim Lavamancer, who is also not especially great in this matchup if they draw Oath. If they don't draw Oath, he's fantastic because you can clear the fetches out of your yard, so that's why I don't get rid of all of them. But I do trim 1, and that's so that I can bring in 4 Price of Progress, which is just absolutely killer in this matchup, and probably one of the #1 reasons that I win this matchup in testing, as well as 3 pieces of Artifact Hate. So in this case, it's 2 Overloads and a Mog Salvage. Salvage is not great in this matchup, obviously, because you're paying full price for it, but one of the innovations in this list, if you haven't been following its development, is the addition of Smokestack. So between Smokestack, Zurin Orb, Sphere of Resistance, it's worth it to have at least a few ways to interact with that side of the deck. The hope here is that between the pops and everything else we've got going on, we should be in good shape. I feel pretty strongly about this game plan, and this opener is wonderful, right? So we have Phyrexian Furnace, which is going to allow us to again control the graveyard, particularly important because we've got a handful of fetches, and we've got Fnatic and Ball Lightning, which are as good against an Oath opening as we can hope for. And again, we have a 4 lands is a great way to start against this deck. So here we go. So they open with Village. I draw Price of Progress, and now I just start keeping a mental count of every point of damage it's worth. Right, 4. Here we get in with Fnatic. We get Furnace down early. So one of the other things that I know Tyrant has been playing around with here is Call of the Herd as sort of an anti-aggro measure. I am kind of curious. I don't know their sideboard plan, so I'm not sure if this is like Oaths out, Call of the Herd in. But here is just another kind of little, again, some side benefits to Furnace because we're going to remove that from their yard. Obviously, we can't attack through it, so we're just kind of sit tight a little bit here. They take the 6 from Ball Lightning. I am not sure if that's the right play. They may have a reason for doing that. But at this point, right, I'm doing my math, right? I've got 1 damage on the board from Fnatic. Price of Progress here represents, 6 points of damage. We have the Incinerate, so we're getting very close to where we need to be to finish this matchup. One of the reasons I'm not going to deal with the elephant token is I just feel like I'm so close, right? I'm adding it up again, especially now that he's getting it for 1. So that's 12, 11, 8, right? We're so close to wrapping up this matchup that I'm happy to let the elephant token get in. So here, right, Sphere's coming down. I want to be able to have access to as much mana as possible. So we're going to fetch and pop. And, I think there's an argument to be made here. If you're playing against pop, don't get mad at me, burn players, but, like, just slow roll those non-basics until you have to. Because basically, puts the game away. And that's all she wrote. So this matchup, this particular game, played essentially textbook. Pop is absolutely enormous in these green Terravore decks. They're just running so many non-basics, and sometimes they just don't have an option to play around Price of Progress, right? They just have to play out their lands, so they can either get man lands on the board or ports, or just do things. And so this played out exactly as the way that I would have wanted this matchup to play out. Furnace did work here, even though it wasn't the work I necessarily anticipated. Whether it was in game 1, which was sort of the game plan, right? Keep the graveyard small, but also just being able to snipe the Call of the Herd before it could get flashback. Eased upon a lot of pressure and allowed me to, for example, not have to really make a choice about whether or not I wanted to incinerate a token, because I knew that the clock was not fast enough, especially with that many non-basics in play and a pop in hand. So, this was a good finals. Again, shout out to all my opponents. I'm going to wrap up with just like a quick overview. So let's move ahead. Okay, so I want to wrap up this video. So first, shout out to all of my opponents. I always enjoy my matches against the Magic Online Society, members. What can we say about the deck? So, I mean, first, it's just, sometimes burn does burn things. We saw a good mix of both what we might call Gear 1 and Gear 2 matchups, right? We had a couple of rounds where, ripping multiple ball lightnings enabled us to really put the pressure on our opponents and finish games quickly before they had an opportunity to execute their game plans. We had a couple of matches where we were able to kind of keep the board suppressed until we were able to kind of, build a win out of what we were able to draw. In terms of Phyrexian Furnace, which is sort of the reason I made this video, because I wanted to sort of show people what it could do as sort of a theory of the case. If we think about how these matchups played out, there were no matchups in this particular playoff where the card ever would have been entirely dead, right? It's not great against Gat, but it does help keep the yard a little bit smaller, which I guess buys you, in theory, a little bit of time against a Psychotog, but I mean, it's a small effect. It's not anything to write home about, but it certainly does something that, in that case, Bauble simply can't do. In the matchup against Gamekeeper combo, it stops the combo unless they can deal with it. So, to that end, it was incredibly effective. It did not play a huge role in the rock matchups in this particular match, but it is worth knowing that it does have applications there. If it's a rock build that happens to be running Call of the Herd, it can certainly get some work done there in the same way that it did in our finals match. It can also help deal with recursion issues, which is one of the ways that they can beat you, right? So them gaining 4 or even 8 life off of Balefs is not the end of the world, but being able to recur that, every turn or almost every turn off of a recurring nightmare is a problem. So it does offer you a way out of that situation. And certainly in the mono green Panza matchup, the ability to suppress the graveyard certainly made it so that Terravor was going to be a less appealing option and really shut down that axis of attack, which enables to focus our energies elsewhere. And in game 2 of that matchup, right, just being able to snipe the Call of the Herd, prior to flashback, boss time, it allows us to execute the game plan that we were hoping to execute. What stood out to me in this particular run, as well as the various leagues I've been playing with this list or versions of this list, is that I have really rarely run into situations where Furnace has hurt me in places where Bauble would not have. So there are situations, obviously, where Bauble is a better card. There are matchups where it's more useful, simply because it's entirely free. Those did not really come up here. And as I think we saw in a lot of these matchups, there are a lot of situations where you simply do have time to sort of, sit on Furnace if you need to, and then, if you need to deploy it, you need to crack it, draw that card, you can. And so we didn't really see any matchups where drawing Furnace actively hurt us, and we saw several cases where it was really important, or at least play a medium to very important role in facilitating a winning game plan against our opponents. So this is something that I'm going to continue to fiddle with. I think it's promising. I am not yet convinced that it's objectively better than Bauble, because again, Bauble's ability on opening hands to very quickly cycle you into fresh cards is really important, particularly when you have less mana available. And there are, again, matchups where Furnace essentially does nothing, right? Against Dreadnought, it essentially does nothing. Against Goblins, it essentially does nothing. And so, that there's a cost, right? And so the question for me remains, is the cost of having a card that is less efficient at doing what it does, right, at least in terms of its secondary function of cycling, worth the benefit of being able to interact with cards in matchups that we otherwise wouldn't really be able to do without eating up sideboard slots, right? So, again, against Terravor, against Recursion, we didn't get to play Elves in this particular run, but I've had success against, sniping Anger or Squee in some of the leagues. So more testing is necessary. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will hopefully be putting out more over the next couple of months as I sort of fiddle around with Burn, and we'll take it from there. So thanks for watching.